We were stranded on Lake Michigan last winter, but we were not alone. Hey guys. I found this written on a letter wrapped in plastic in a bottle that washed up on the beach shore earlier this summer. It took me a while to dry it out and transcribe it. I'm about halfway done, hope to have the other part up next week. We were stranded on Lake Michigan last winter, but we were not alone. Not at first. And not now, at the end. I am not an astronaut, not even close. Let's get that out of the way first. I have never dreamed of being an astronaut. In fact, I can barely stand to take a plane for more than a couple of hours. There is something about the lift-off that leaves my stomach churning. Something about the confrontation with the scales of existence that unsettles my mind too much. I am comfortable with snug spaces, with being inside my small apartment on a cold winter's day, oblivious to the blizzard that surrounds me while I drink a warm cup of coffee, preferably laced with a hint of hazelnut, reading a good book or catching up on some television. Maybe that was why my professor thought I would be a good fit for this. He approached me last fall, right after midterms. The experiment seemed simple enough. We were to go to a makeshift station on one of the islands in Lake Michigan in December, right after finals, and stay through early February. We would receive waivers for missing the first part of classes that semester and a university tuition waiver for 2 semesters along with stipend for $5,000. That was basically worth $15,000 to me, and given how much I had taken out in student loans, I couldn't afford to pass up the opportunity. I knew very little about the experiment until orientation. By this time it was late November, and getting quite chilly. I made my way to the classroom where the professor told me the orientation would take place, and he was there alone, waiting for me with a smile on his face and a TV and VHS setup. It looked like something old-fashioned and fit in the dreary gray design of the old room. Looking back on it, this should have been my first hint that something was off. "These are the documents for you to sign beforehand," he said, handing me a stack of papers, including a release and instructions on how payment would be submitted to my account directly. "Anything involving human subjects requires quite a bit of authorization and informed consent," he continued. "So I have something here that will explain the experiment to you, and I am here to answer any questions." When the video began, it was clear that it was shot somewhere in the Arctic. It was what looked to be older footage, maybe from the 90s or the early part of the 2000s. About halfway in, I realized what the purpose of the experiment actually was: testing the effects of isolation on ordinary people, for the purpose of helping NASA plan for long-term colonization off Earth. The video was fairly straightforward, a collage of several months' worth of isolation experiments conducted years ago in cabins in the Canadian tundra. The paperwork did have some fine print, though. I was going to be taped at all times. There was no privacy at all. The material would be kept on hand indefinitely, but not subject to release unless it was necessary for a lawsuit or a criminal investigation. The idea of being filmed on the toilet did not sit with me that well, but it wasn't like I was going to be having sex on this trip and had to worry about naked photographs showing up on the internet. Moreover, they weren't going to monitor the cameras live. They were recording it for analysis later, after we had returned. So I signed off, went to the university clinic for my free physical and health screening, and I was off. My family was not thrilled about it. I had to leave 2 weeks before Christmas, shortly after finals were over, and I couldn't tell them what the experiment was about or where I was going, which I didn't even know about at this point. My mother fretted about missing the holidays, especially since I hadn't been back for Thanksgiving, but my dad was kind of proud of me once he found out about the tuition waiver and the stipend. We spent a few days together and I got my Christmas gifts early, then made my way to the rendezvous point. There was nothing untoward about the experiment at this point. The rendezvous point was in public, and we all made our way into a van that took us to parts unknown. I met the other isolationists, as we started calling ourselves, Dan, Jake and Lucy. And Jocelyn makes 4, I thought to myself at the time. After about 4 hours of traveling, we arrived in an airport in Charlevoix, and boarded a plane. This was when I began to experience some anxiety. Like I said, I am not very enthusiastic about flight. But the trip was very short. We were bound for one of the islands on Lake Michigan, as it turned out. Jake wasn't a student, but he had been recruited through the university's research team that was handling the NASA grant. The same was true of Lucy. Dan was the only other university student, but I didn't know him. Really, I didn't know any of them. We were perfect strangers, and that was the point of the experience. I also didn't know anything about the place we were going. I know much more about the island today, of course, but back then I knew almost nothing about it. Only that it contained a public airstrip, that a temporary lodge had been set up at the end of the airstrip in what we called living pods that were fueled by wind and solar energy, with a battery that could keep power on for about 5 days, and a backup generator that was attached to the common pod unit in the event of a real emergency. We had to make a journal entry a few times per week, which would be collected by the control group at the end of the experiment. They were going to be on the other side of the island, also for emergencies. They were also in contact with first responders on the mainland that would be on call at various points and could be flown in if we ran into a problem, and there was a food storage area adjacent to our living pods. The living pods were very similar to something that the research team told us would be introduced commercially a few months later. We were told that there was a fairly firm agreement with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources that the experiment would leave a minimal environmental footprint on the island, which was protected and isolated. But we had a pretty amazing setup. There was functioning running water in the pods, and there was even a toilet. Not that it beat apartment living. We had to monitor our use of water and minimize toilet use. How was that supposed to work, you might ask? We also had a caloric intake limitation, not hard to keep up with when you are eating astronaut-grade food. There was an additional outhouse in the woods outside of the strip clearing, if something malfunctioned. I brought about a dozen books with me, and there was a communal pod that housed a TV and DVD player, and a small library of books supplied by the research team. I suppose that these distractions were not integral to the experiment. I warmed up to Jake pretty easily, and started to suspect that Dan and Lucy were hooking up every now and then. It didn't take very long for them to become an item, and although I liked Jake well enough, he was not my type, and he alluded to his partner, which either meant unavailable or gay, or I suppose both. There were a few additional rules. We did not have access to any communications equipment, and we were to avoid the control area on the tip of the island. And for 2 weeks, there wasn't much reason to go there or to be concerned with it. After 3 weeks, there were some strange and unsettling things that started to happen, things that would eventually make me question my decision to participate in this experiment. It was dusk and the sun was setting behind a clouded Lake Michigan horizon. I was listening to my MP3 player and walking along the lakeshore when I noticed that there appeared to be some sort of light coming from the area between the island and the Leelanau Peninsula. I stared at it for a while before deciding it had to be a fire, and then walked back a short way to the landing strip to tell the others. Lucy suggested it was someone ice fishing, but that seemed unlikely. I did not see anyone out there, and it would have been miles away from the peninsula to be visible to us, since that night we couldn't even make out the lights from the cities there. Jake walked with me back to the shoreline, but there was nothing to be seen. I shrugged it off, thinking that maybe it was a faint light that broke through the haze. The last few nights had been pretty cold, and even though the pods were fairly warm, there was this wet, cold feeling that you could never really shake off when you got inside for bed. I didn't get much sleep that night, waking up shivering and feeling damp. And the next day was also pretty dark, cloud cover. The professor and his associates had assured us that the wind would keep the power on in the event the cloud cover prevented the solar cells from doing their job. That next night I was talking with Jake and playing some card games. I was losing, maybe on purpose. I was bored and getting a little flirtatious, but he didn't seem interested. After about an hour I was surprised when he pulled a little flask from his cargo pants pocket. Want some? I was a little surprised. Alcohol was not permitted on this trip. But after 3 weeks of powdered milk, water, and a tiny allotment of soft drinks, you aren't always thinking about the rules. I nodded, glancing around a bit nervous about what the cameras would see. But then, they wouldn't find out until well after we were back on the mainland. I took a swig. It was awful. Something like Bacardi 151, at least that was how it tasted to me. Little more than drinking gasoline. I choked it down and we got back to playing cards. My game seemed to improve a bit with some alcohol. It felt like we had been playing for only a few minutes when I glanced at the clock and saw that it was almost midnight. Not that we were on a schedule or anything, but my perception of time was starting to go haywire in this place. The last few days had been fairly dark, but even when the sun was out you never wanted to spend much time outside, and the pods did not have windows. I was about to suggest that we call it a night when lights started flickering. I looked across the small table at Jake, and he looked back with a raised eyebrow. We both stood up as the flickering intensified and both gasped audibly when the lights went out, followed by a pounding at the common pod door. "You guys in there?" I caught my breath again. It was Lucy. "You need to get out here and see this," she said, pushing open the door. The backup generator kicked into gear while she was talking, but the lights started flickering again right away, but not as bad this time. After a couple of minutes the power seemed to start working again without a problem. Lucy asked what was up with the lights, but we had no idea. We put on our coats and boots and gloves and followed her outside, taking our flashlights with us. She took us to the shoreline, which was like staring out into an empty void. It was a brief walk, but she mentioned seeing lights, and asked me again about what I had seen the previous night. This time, though, there was no sign of lights from the mainland, and no stars in the sky. The moon wasn't even visible. You could just make out the lights through the tree leans back to the landing strip and our living area. Dan was waiting there, gazing into the distance across Lake Michigan. "Did you tell them about the lights?" They explained that they had seen 3 lights in the distance, faint but visible. They disappeared not long after Lucy left, Dan said, pointing to where they had been. Which, given the low visibility, was pretty much anywhere across the stretch of the ice-covered blackness that was Lake Michigan. We waited a while, but nothing happened, and so we went back to our rooms. I am pretty sure Dan and Lucy roomed together that night. The next day was clear and brilliant, and you could see across the lake in both directions to the small peninsula and the mitten, as we were calling the Michigan mainland. There were no other problems with the power, which made me relieved. The generator could only go for 5 days if the solar and wind systems failed, which would mean contacting control. I walked around the island a bit, and went through the woods. That's when I noticed that there were deer footprints, which was strange in and of itself. There weren't supposed to be any deer here. When I went back, I found the 3 other isolationists in the common pod and told them what I had seen. Probably because it was cold enough the lake has frozen over and they wandered in, Jake offered, looking up from his book. They mentioned that might happen. Might have come from another island in the archipelago or even from the mainland. The days passed, and if it wasn't for the clocks I would have lost track of time altogether. This experiment was making me realize how dependent I was on modern technology and the presence of other people. I had already finished most of the books I brought with me, and we had all watched most of the DVDs, and there was still more than a month to kill here. We had not had any more problems with the power, and I had almost forgotten about it when I was in my pod and reading when the lights started to flicker again. I didn't want to be stuck there alone if the power went out, so I made my way to the common pod, and noticed it then. It looked almost like the northern lights. In fact, that was my first reaction, because it was this rippling mass of light that was moving across the sky. There was only one problem: a storm was coming, and the sky was covered in clouds. Before I could even ask myself what I was seeing, the lights disappeared, and the snow started. I looked up into the night sky, feeling the flakes against me, barely visible in the dim light emanating from the lights that made the pathway to the common pod. After a minute looking to the skies, I made my way to the common area. No one else was there, so I started looking through the books in the common area library. Nothing looked very appealing, so I turned on the TV and put in a movie. Something light, an old romantic comedy. I fell asleep watching it. When I woke up, I thought the movie was still on, but I quickly realized that it was over and the TV was actually off. I knew that I heard something, though, and I sat up on the couch, listening intently. I could hear the wind, moaning in that distant way it has, a sound that evoked nothing in particular except the icy wintry black void outside of the room. I started to fall into a kind of daze listening to it, mesmerized by its slightly broken consistency and the pull it had on my mind. My thoughts were drifting with it, thinking about the lights and the deer, and the snow. It seemed almost like the wind was getting closer, moving and crawling through the door and making its way towards me, driving the warmth out of the room. There were no lights. I got up, realizing that I actually was cold. There was no heat, and the temperature was dropping fast. I put on my winter gear, grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, finding myself facing a massive blizzard. The lights that illuminated the path to the living pods were either not working, or blotted out by the snow. The wind was whipping at my face, and it was colder than anything that I had ever experienced before. A cold that cuts into you quickly, numbing you. I guessed the way to Jake's pod, and turned on my flashlight to light the way. The light started to flicker almost instantly, like the battery was loose, and then it started to dim, slowly, until the light disappeared altogether. I thought about going back to the common pod to try a different battery, but I was nervous and needed human contact. Jake would have a better idea of what we should do if the power was out. I had to wake him up, pounding on the door to his locked pod. He opened it, shivering, and the warmth of it hit me and drew me in. I pushed my way past him, telling him that the power was out, and he nodded back. I guessed as much, he said. He was fumbling near the small desk area, and his flashlight lit up. He wasn't dressed for sleep, still wearing a sweater and jeans. I watched him in the faint light of the flashlight as he put his boots over what seemed like a double layer of socks. The room was not warm, but I didn't want to leave. Still, we did, going first to Lucy's empty but unlocked pod, then to the one that we thought might house both of them. We pounded on the door, and when no one answered we went in to find it vacant. We doubled back to the common pod, but there wasn't anyone there. Still, we stopped there to talk. It was hard to hear him over the wind, even inside. We decided that they must have made their way to control when the power went out. Nothing else made sense, although even that explanation was pushing at the outer edges of reason. Who would venture to the other side of the island in this weather? We decided to wait for them to come back, and our confidence in our explanation dwindled with each passing hour. We were relieved when the power came back on, right before daybreak. But they would have come back before dawn, certainly. With the storm over, we decided to trudge our way over to the northern point of the island, to control. It was not easy, the snow had really built up, and we didn't want to risk getting lost in the forest. We followed the coastline, and it took us about 2 hours. Or what felt like 2 hours, anyway. The facility the research team had named Control was an old lighthouse and one large pod. I was worried when we got close, there were no footprints on the way in or surrounding the pod. Jake told me not to worry, that there was so much snow it would have covered any footprints from the night before. The door to the lighthouse was chained and it was clear no one had been in there for a while. We pounded on the door to the pod, but no one answered. When Jake tried, it opened. And that was when we knew there was a problem. The pod was empty. It was also frigid. I checked the fridge and the food cabinets, but there was nothing in either. There were no sheets, blankets, or pillows on the twin double-stacked beds in the corner. Nothing to show that anyone had ever been here. Certainly not recently. Certainly not since we arrived on the island. We had been abandoned, but we were not alone. Thanks for the response, everyone. I decided to split up the remainder of the transcribed letter to make it more manageable to read. I might even finish it earlier than expected at this rate. In the wake of discovering the abandoned outpost at the control site, the gray skies and iced waters that surrounded the island took on a malevolent character. The island was no longer our voluntary retreat from civilization, a contribution to science and human exploration. We were over 10 miles of ice away from the nearest inhabited island, which rendered the billowing clouds and iced lake bars in the cell, the perimeters of our new prison. Jake tried to rationalize it. All part of the experiment, he hypothesized. What better way to test the stress of isolation than dividing the group and appearing to cut the cord that tethered our remote band to human civilization? I wanted to believe him. I tried. The only alternative was too unnerving to contemplate. We decided to return to the landing strip. There was a chance that Dan and Lucy had made their way back, since we had not found any sign of them on the coastal site. This time we traveled through the forest, avoiding the harsh wind that whipped and roared along the shoreline. The heavy snowfall the night before weighed heavy on the trees, muffling the natural sounds of the forest. The whirling wind nearly drowned out the only audible noises in our vicinity, our footsteps, breathing and, if only in my mind, the raised heartbeats that followed our visit to control. Jake was walking ahead of me and paused suddenly, looking up and away, in front of us. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Those bells." I stood still in the snow, feeling the damp penetrate into my boots, shifting my wet feet uncomfortably. It was a low, faint sound. Not bells, I realized. Wind chimes. We followed the sound, hoping that there was some sign of the others there, I suppose. It seemed to take us off our path along the border between the forest and the shoreline, deeper into the woods. The wind chime was hanging from a makeshift arch of wooden branches fastened to two trees that were only a few feet apart. It was hanging from a string of sticks and black hair or fur, a collection of old rusted keys and iron nails and glass and animal bone clashing together to create the sound. With the exception of the keys, it was all material that you would find washed up on the shore or in the woods. Below the arch on the snow-covered ground lay a wreath made from gnarly twigs and branches and petoskey stones. It sat on the snow, new and undisturbed. Someone had been here in the last few hours, but there was no sign of prints, save our own. We circled the scene and stared at it for several minutes, burning it into our memory. It might be important, we reasoned, and we had no camera or phones to take a photo. Yet there was nothing else remarkable about this area. No apparent reason for any landmark. We left, following our tracks back the way we came, and resumed our trip along the edge of the forest and the sand that made up the shoreline. The chimes faded into the distance, then disappeared in the wind. With the dim winter sun obscured by clouds, the passage of time was hard to gauge. Had it been most of the day away from the airstrip? Were we approaching nightfall again? The island was not that large, it should not take all day to circumvent it, not even in snow. Time, though, seemed inconstant, rushing like a rapid river at one moment and slowing to a crawl the next. Eventually we arrived at the airstrip and made our way back to the common pod. And there it was, a note on the communal table, in handwriting that I thought looked like it belonged to Lucy. A note, very simple and short. "Jake and Jocelyn went to look for you at control site. If you find this, please wait for us here." That was it? Nothing really. I did not question the note's authenticity. But was it here all along? I thought back to when we had looked for the others the night before, when we huddled together in the common pod as the blizzard raged outside. Surely we would have seen this? In the middle of the table? I made coffee. Jake drank from his flask. He started reading a book from the common library, something about the history and geography of the islands. He looked up at me, confused. There's no mention of a lighthouse, he said. Only on the other island, the one closest to us. Given everything that had happened that day, it seemed the least of our concerns. I asked how old the book was and he shrugged. Maybe they didn't mention it because it isn't very big, or it is new, I told him. I didn't want any other mysteries. We had enough on our plate as it was. Lucy and Dan missing, the control site abandoned, that strange altar in the woods, that was enough to deal with. I did not have time to think about the failure to list a local landmark in an old book in our common library. I watched the clock as the seconds and minutes and hours ticked away. By now, over 24 hours had passed since the disappearance of Lucy and Dan. I was starting to doubt their chances, when the door to the pod opened and they walked in, cloaked in winter gear, fresh snow covering their hoods. I felt a rush of relief and tension drain from my shoulders. That relief changed to confusion, though, when they appeared angry, yelling at us, asking us where we were. "We could ask you the same," Jake shot back. "We walked around looking for you all day." Lucy opened her mouth to say something, then paused, a confused look overtaking her. "All day? Jake, we have only been gone a few hours. After the power went out, we tried to wake you up but there wasn't anyone in either pod." Her voice trailed off, and she looked to Dan. "That's right," he said, nodding for confirmation. To himself or for our benefit. "We visited control. They made sure the power was back up." He gestured at the lights. It worked, obviously. The exchange that followed was tense. Jake and I, we were convinced that a day had passed. We had seen it, we had waited to leave until that morning, we had visited the control site, we had found that thing in the woods. They had woken to the power outage, discovered we were missing, left for the control site, spoken with the researchers and restored power. They did not see any lighthouse. The others were also just as adamant that only a few hours had passed, that there was still a blizzard. I walked to the door, opened it and discovered it was still snowing very hard. It hadn't been when we returned to the airstrip. We mulled over the possibilities. I desperately wanted to believe Dan and Lucy, because I wanted the safety of control and our link to civilization. But we had visited the control site, and I had seen it with my own eyes. There was nothing there. "None of it makes any sense, honestly," Jake offered. "We saw a lighthouse, but this book says there is no lighthouse." "You say that there was no lighthouse." "We see lights from what we think is Lila now, but from the maps I'm not even sure that we can see the mainland from the coast that borders the strip. And this place has a history that no one told us about." Jake pulled the book out, flipping to a page he had bookmarked. "Some sicko ran a child pornography ring out here, and used this airstrip to bring in his victims. Back in the 70s. We read over the description of the events. The Fox Islands are two small, uninhabited islands off the coast of Michigan's southern peninsula, over 20 miles from Charlevoix. The smaller of the twin islands is North Fox, a wooded preserve bisected by a visible airstrip. It was that airstrip that Francis D. Sheldon, the island's former owner, used to transport groups of young boys there for sordid purposes. An Ivy League-educated heir to his parents' fortune, Sheldon and his co-conspirators chartered Brother Paul's Children's Mission, a pedophile ring disguised as a nature camp for prepubescent and adolescent boys. Upon arrival, the boys were forced to engage in sexual acts and were photographed for use in underground child pornography networks. Several photographs recovered by state and federal investigating agencies revealed the undeniable background of the North Fox Island. After an accomplice was arrested and charged in 1976, Sheldon fled on his private plan and escaped abroad, dying before he could be tried 20 years later. One of the men caught with photos taken on the island, Christopher Bush, 25, of Birmingham, killed himself 2 years later, and by that time was the leading suspect in a spate of child murders in lower Michigan's Oakland County. It was certainly creepy and did nothing to settle my nerves, but it also had nothing to do with the missing time and the discrepancies between our two experiences. I started to worry about Jake's drinking. This place would take its toll on the most sober of minds, and he had clearly stocked up before he came here. Dan was disgusted with the story but clearly regarded Jake with skepticism. After Jake excused himself and went back to his pod, Dan took me aside and asked me if Jake was paranoid. I told him that I wasn't a shrink. "But you are studying to be one," he answered matter-of-factly. "Like me. And that's why Professor Ogletree chose us for this. You know that?" I had, in fact, suspected that was the case. It was the only link that Dan and I shared, as his students at the university. "You've read about the Hebb experiments." I had. Donald Hebb was a controversial psychologist who had studied university students under conditions of extreme sensory deprivation. Over a short period of time, the subjects began to experience vivid and uncontrollable hallucinations, and became susceptible to belief in supernatural phenomenon when exposed to arguments for the existence of ghosts and spirits. The Canadian government had financed the studies, hoping to uncover the secrets of alleged communist brainwashing techniques. Our experience of isolation was not nearly as extreme, however, and we were not alone, unlike Hebb's subjects. Jake had not experienced a subjective hallucination. I was with him when Lucy and Dan disappeared during the blizzard. I was with him when we visited the control site. I was with him when we saw the arch and wreath and wind chimes in the woods. These things happened. Dan was not entirely convinced. "I'm not saying you didn't experience something as well," he added. "And I'm not exempting us from this either. But the purpose of this study is to examine the psychological impact of extreme isolation in a small communal setting. To recreate the likely conditions of a prolonged visit to another planet." He did not say, but did not have to, that joint hallucinations were also recorded in isolation studies. Still, the accounts of synchronized, collective hallucinations usually revealed discrepancies in the stories. The event was experienced distinctly, and recollected seamlessly to fit a narrative that the parties had agreed upon after discussion. As near as I could remember, I had seen the same things that Jake had seen. We had not discussed the details after the fact. I made journal entries that night, that I consult now as I write this. I saw the lighthouse, I saw the abandoned control site. I saw the arch and the wreath. I knew this to be true then. That night, I started reading the book Jake had pulled from the library. Myths and Legends of Northern Michigan. It was an older book, from the 1990s, and contained mostly useless, tawdry, and sensational stories of the region. Pedophile rings, a serial killer from Charlevoix, UFO sightings over the lake, and a few ghost stories. Certainly not a reliable guide to the geography and history of the islands. But given the nature of the experiment, I began to assume that it was there for a reason. During the Hebb experiment, the subjects were exposed to controlled stimuli. If they wanted to understand the communal effects of isolation, including the possibility of communal hallucinations and paranoia, the researchers would probably expose us to suggestive external events as well. And they must have expected us to think about this. We knew what the purpose of the experiment was, and we were not even as highly educated as the hypothetical astronauts on an interplanetary expedition were likely to be. The books in the library were just as likely to hold clues as the arch in the woods. Or so I told myself. The next day I checked on Jake's pod to see if he wanted to join me and circumvent the island, but he wasn't there. I decided to go alone anyway. I needed to clear my thoughts, process what was happening. I began walking alongside the shoreline, in the opposite direction of control. We were still under orders to avoid the site unless there was an emergency, like the earlier power outage. I had to assume that Lucy and Dan were right about the site, and that it had not been abandoned by the researchers. Successful completion of the study was required in order to collect the tuition waiver and stipend, so I could not risk breaking the rules and confirming the existence of control. and in the back of my mind, it was still more comforting to believe what Lucy and Dan had told us than to realize that control was gone. I started to think about the experiments I had reviewed in my courses with Professor Ogletree. A number of those experiments would fail institutional review board standards today, because they lacked informed consent. I had reviewed the forms, watched the video and asked questions. I could not remember discussing any exposure to external stimuli, nothing like what we had experienced today. So it struck me as unlikely that the experiment was responsible for what we were experiencing, or had altered the environment in such a way to terrorize and confuse us. I decided to try to find the arch again. I became lost in the woods pretty easily, but I knew that I was bounded on all sides by the open and frozen Lake Michigan. And walking through the woods would eventually lead me to the airstrip, since it bisected most of island. There were at least some advantages to being stranded on a wooded island, as long as it was small enough. I made my way through the woods, but did not recognize anything. And I was careful to remain away from the area that I knew was control, but I was near the edge. Eventually I decided I was too hungry and thirsty to continue, so I started the walk back to the airstrip. That's when I came across the deer stand. If you live in Michigan or any place with hunting, there's a good chance you have seen them before. They are essentially tree houses that are used by hunters to watch prey from a high vantage point in the woods. This one was a small wooden cube and attached to a tree with a wooden ladder leading up to it, the openings on the side covered by flapping gray tarp. I decided to climb the ladder and look inside. If nothing else, it would give me a better view of the surrounding area. When I pushed the tarp aside, I could see through the tree lean onto the landing strip. The view was clear, obstructed only by gently falling snow. I also discovered a pad of paper. There were a few dated entries, mostly observations of deer. The hunting party had been keeping a log. I flipped through the pages, but there was nothing of consequence. It was only when I set it down on the floor that I noticed the engraving it had covered. F. Sheldon plus J. Ogletree were here. Francis Sheldon and John Ogletree. The pedophile owner of this island, someone who shared the first initial and last name of our professor. Engraved in the wooden floor of the deer stand. I resisted the temptation to jump to any irrational conclusions that owed more to an episode of unsolved mysteries than logical deduction. According to the book, Francis Sheldon was dead and had been dead for almost 20 years. I did not know how old Professor Ogletree was, but he could not be much older than 50. There was little chance that he knew Francis Sheldon. I crawled out of the deer stand and made my way back to the base camp. I decided to talk to Dan about this. I knocked on his pod door and he answered, Lucy with him sitting on his bed. I told them about the deer stand, and the engraving. Dan was quick to blame Jake's paranoia. Hadn't he found that chapter in the book? And wasn't he missing from his pod this morning? I don't trust him, Dan said. He's been drinking, and he keeps reading those stories about the island, going off on wild tangents. We decided to tell Jake about the engraving, to gauge his reaction. It did not go well. See? Jake said. For him this was confirmation of the malevolence of this experiment. Your professor knew about this. He's fucking with us. Jake was slurring his speech and stumbling, clearly intoxicated. I guess the stress of this place was working its black magic on him. Dan did not help matters. He accused Jake of engraving the message on the deer stand. Of shit-stirring as he called it. As the conversation grew heated, Lucy suggested that we go take a look at the engraving. Everyone seemed to agree that was a good idea. By this point, it was starting to get dark out, so we hurried through the forest that bordered the airstrip. We found the deer stand. There was only one problem, both the pad of paper and the engraving were gone, and the gray tarp had also been torn away. Dan turned on me, furious. Furious for scaring the group, for making shit up or for hallucinating or for both, furious for indulging Jake's warped and conspiratorial fantasies. I started to cry, out of frustration, out of fear and anxiety. Because I knew, that someone was fucking with us now. But Dan could not be mollified or convinced. The temperature started to drop sharply that night as the sun set. I spent that night in my pod, making a journal entry of the day's events, recounting everything that I had seen and heard, for use at a moment like this now as I write. I wrapped myself in my blankets, chilled even with the heat. Exhausted from hiking, exhausted from crying. Thirsty, but unwilling to make my way to the fridge. Better to stay in bed, to sleep through this nightmare. I woke in the middle of the night, thirsty and hungry. I put on my coat and boots, grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the common pod, eager for something warm, something filling. Hot chocolate maybe. On the way over, I noticed that the lights started to flicker again, and I instinctively looked up to the sky, but there was nothing there. There were no clouds at all, and the night sky was brilliantly illuminated, showing part of the Milky Way. Usually looking into the sky was enough to give me a sense of vertigo, but tonight it was comforting, a reminder of what we were volunteering for. As I turned my attention back to the pod, I started to hear voices coming from the shore, beyond the tree line. I decided to peek through the tree line, to see if the others were on the beach. I aimed my flashlight into the beach, onto the frozen waters of the lake. I could not see anything out there, or hear the voices. The flashlight started to flicker again, until there was no light. Professor Ogletree really needed to invest in a higher-end battery. I walked back to the common area, and found the others stewing inside. I hesitated before asking them about the voices. I did not want them to sit in judgment again, especially not Dan. We all mumbled our hellos as I made my way to the cabinet and started to make hot chocolate. Dan walked over to me, and asked me if we could talk privately for a minute while the water boiled. We stepped outside and he started to apologize for the way he had acted earlier. I was being an asshole, he admitted. I'm sure that this is part of the experiment. Can you forgive me? And maybe make me a cup of hot chocolate? He grinned when asking the last question, and I laughed and nodded and said sure. I was ready to step back inside when the voices started again. Dan looked to the shoreline. He heard them, too. When we stepped back into the common pod, the lights started to flicker again and I felt my anxiety ratchet up several notches. Guys, grab some flashlights, Dan said. We could hear someone on the shoreline. We walked back to the shoreline as a group, Lucy, Dan, and Jake carrying flashlights while mine still refused to work. They pointed them across the shoreline, but there was nothing there. Still, we could hear the voices, they were audible but incomprehensible. Multiple voices, and impossible to determine if they were male or female. But human voices, surely. The flashlights began to flicker again, and all of them dimmed until they died. We walked back to the campsite, and started discussing what we had not seen this time, but heard. A collective hallucination of those voices seemed unlikely this time around, and even Dan was persuaded. We decided to head to control the next day, to complain about the flashlights and the electrical interference. My body was still exhausted from the day, and I slept soundly. Too soundly, in fact. When I woke up it was nearly 11 a.m., and we were supposed to head out around midday. I gathered up my things, dressed and headed over to the common area. And that's when Lucy and Jake told me that Dan was missing. That he had disappeared. I made them retell the story in as much detail as they could remember, although there was not much. He was awake and had breakfast with them in the common pod, and they had all walked together outside. Lucy went with Dan to her pod, and when she turned around after shutting the door, he was gone. It wasn't like there was much to search. Lucy was understandably upset. People just don't disappear into thin air. I had to agree with her there. But I also reasoned that he could not be far. That we should look for him before we went to control. The only fresh tracks to follow took us back along the landing strip to the deer stand. We could hear wind chimes as we approached, and we found him. God, we found him. His body was disheveled, his black hair overgrown and cut erratically at points. He was hanging from the tree that housed the deer stand. The wind chimes were now affixed to the interior of the deer stand itself, and the wreath from hell was underneath him. Lucy broke down sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with grief. I tried to console her, grabbing her, turning her away from the body. Jake stared in shock, then started climbing the ladder. I shouted at him, to stop him from disturbing the crime scene. He reminded me that he was wearing gloves, and he needed to check on something. Tears started to well up in my own eyes, and it was so cold it felt like they were freezing on contact with the air. Dan was dead. I forced Lucy to walk back with me to the campsite, and called for Jake to come back down. We had to reach control. We trudged our way back through the snow, as gray clouds gathered over the island, threatening another storm. I could not leave Lucy alone. I could not leave any of them alone. And I could not risk being alone, or on this island, any longer. We needed to make our way back to control. It took her hours to calm down, but Jake's whiskey helped. He had turned to one of his books, reading intently. Lucy eventually fell asleep, or passed out if you prefer, and while she slept, he whispered to me. He had been on the inside of the deer stand, and the engraving was back. And there was a book. He handed it to me. Dan's journal entries. Look at the last date, he added. May 2015. Over 3 months away, and 3 months from the time that the experiment was scheduled to end. I gestured outside. It clearly wasn't springtime. Jake asked me if I had a better explanation. Better than a hanged man from the future? But there was more in the journal entries as we pored over them quietly, while Lucy slept. Dan's first entry was dated November of last year. The day of my orientation. I saved it. November 22nd, 2014. Yesterday Joe informed me that subject J1 completed orientation. Academic files entered into database. Subject J1 is 21F. Subject J1 has completed intro, personality, SOC, data analysis. Subject enrolled in abnormal and research design. Familiar with HEB experiment. J1 is medium income level, 40-70K household, 3 dependents. Caucasian father, mixed race mother. Spanish proficiency. It was me. He was describing what passed for a profile. The next entry was dated in December. December 9th. Yesterday Joe informed me subject J2 completed orientation. No academic files for entry. Subject J2 is 22M. Low income level. Caucasian parentage. English only native. Jake. And Joe was presumably John Ogletree. I wanted to read it all, but my mind was racing from information overload. I set the journal aside, trying to collect my thoughts. If Dan was part of the research team, did Lucy know about this? I schemed through the remaining entries, but there was nothing clear on that point. It was clear that they had become intimate. He wrote about her often enough, but it was not clear he told her about his role. His entries only mentioned visiting the control site with her, and then gave his own description of our account. Were we going to be forced to interrogate her when she woke up? I stepped outside to discuss this with Jake. It was entirely possible that the entries were forged to cast suspicion on him. At this point, the only thing that I knew for certain was that we needed to get off of the island and alert the authorities. But we still did not trust Lucy. She was upset, clearly, but she was also the last person to see Dan alive. Neither of us believed it was a suicide, and there were not many suspects on this rock. We were losing daylight, so we decided to leave Lucy to sleep and made our way to the control site. If Dan and Lucy had been telling the truth, it was possible that there was someone there. We left a note for her just in case. I'm so sorry, Lucy. We made it to control by dusk. It began to snow again when we arrived, and the site looked just as abandoned as it had before. But this time there was no lighthouse, and there was no living pod. Just an empty shoreline, and flickering lights in the distance as night fell. Jake wanted to leave the island, to walk to the flickering lights across the frozen waters. He wanted to leave Lucy behind, to let others come back for her once we had reached safety. I was the one who refused to leave her behind. I should have listened to him. I could not, of course, I know that now. The only solace that this place provides is its sheer inevitability. I think that Jake was scared of walking over the ice alone. I did not blame him. It would be treacherous, over 10 miles to the nearest sign of human civilization. It had been so cold that we thought, we hoped, there was enough ice to make it to the mainland or to the nearest inhabited island. We did not want to stay here and die. Not like Dan. But there were practical considerations that Jake seemed willing to ignore. There was a storm gathering, which would make crossing even more treacherous. And who would cross the churning, turbulent waters of Lake Michigan at night, when weakly frozen patches of ice would be completely invisible? Lucy wanted to wait for control. She refused to believe that there was nothing left at the site. I tried to persuade her. There was so much weird shit happening, so much that we did not know, but she continued in her faith in the experiment. She insisted that this must all be part of the experiment's design, even Dan's death, which she now called apparent, despite the body. Jake did not believe that anymore. I wanted to believe it, but I could not afford to take that risk. And the only one who really believed it, the only person who had any reason to trust this experiment, was hanging from a tree less than a mile from our base camp. The ribbons of light returned that night, more brilliant than ever before. We knew because the power went out. It was clear to me that the eerie, rippling and organic patterns were somehow related to the power outages. The ambient green glow was not enough to read by, which delayed Jake's plans to finish the remaining entries in Dan's journal. At first I imagined this was all the result of electromagnetic interference. In the past we had broken into the emergency supplies, but this time we tried to light candles. Whatever drained the power also inhibited fire for more than a few seconds. Another sign that this was something beyond our ability to explain, even by appealing to the dwindling hope that this was all somehow part of Ogletree's plan. Even in the face of the increasingly bizarre and surreal turns that our island expedition had taken, I was more concerned with surviving the plunging temperatures without a power supply. How long could we survive if the power did not turn on? What if the strange lights in the sky never left? If we could not light a match on this god-forsaken place? If control had abandoned us to the alien and hostile elements that seemed to flourish on this island, we would not last long. We had resolved to try for the mainland the next morning. There was no other choice really. Without a reliable power source or any way of calling for help, it was only a matter of time. Even the shortest month of the year was too long without heat. That night, as the wind screamed and the snow rushed across the airstrip, I could not stop thinking of the lifeless body that was hanging in the woods, twisting in the cold air. How many secrets died with Dan? The purpose of this experiment? The fate of control? Would I ever learn the answers to these questions? Or would I die here in the cold with the others? I did not sleep. I don't think any of us could sleep that night. By the early morning the power returned. Lucy did not want to leave the island, but we told her we would walk back through the control site. We gathered what we could, backpacks filled with some food and water, 2 flashlights each and some batteries. We dressed warmly. We were going to need it. When there was enough light that morning, before we left, I read some more of Dan's journal. I did not have time to read it all the way through, but so little of it dated after his disappearance made sense. He described an island that grew warmer, talked about feeling its warmth even in the dead night of the long winter. He described people walking on the sands, leaving footprints. It was so strange that I almost missed the significance of the dates on the entries, before the last one. They were not all chronological, and at some point he had abandoned dates for season descriptions. Summer. Can see and feel it, behind the wall of my winter prison. Saw the boys again, playing in the fort. The one in the red shirt looked familiar. He looked at me, and then looked away. Heard adult voices approaching, and they ran away. Then the cold came back. The next entry was only dated winter and described finding one of the wreaths in the woods. My confusion only grew as he jumped across the seasons, months, even years. When I read it then, I thought that either his hallucinations were growing stronger, the long-term effects of isolation, or this was planted. Winter. It has been 3 days since I saw the boys in the fort. Yesterday, though, I heard them. And I heard other sounds. The sounds of the men with the boys. My mind has been corrupted by that book. There is no one else here. I have looked for the others, but there are still no signs of them at the base camp. The site is empty, more desolate than ever. Only the strange lights in the sky. Sometimes it feels warm, and I can see the others on the island, the boys, and the men, and the summer sand and the blazing sun of a warm summer's day. Rarely do they see me. Except for the one. Winter. I found the control site again. It was abandoned. Signs of a fire. It looked different than anything that I had seen. I have taken shelter here. For 2 days I have not been able to locate the base camp. I slept in the fort and heard things. The boy came back. He can hear me sometimes, see me sometimes. He comes here to hide from Frank. Or maybe just to see me, the ghost. There is no extraction site. Maybe there never was one. Maybe that was a lie that Ogletree told me. A lie that I shared with Lucy, one of so many. Why would John leave us here to die? John did not seem like a monster. He had invited me to his house, I met his wife. And what interest would NASA have in studying the deaths of student volunteers? The control site may have been abandoned, but I found some papers. A memorandum, written by one J. Ogletree. But the content is not psychological. It reads like something written by a quack cosmologist, and dated December 2017. The cover is a sculpture from the Air and Space Museum in DC, The Continuum, by architect and sculptor Charles O. Perry in 1976. The abstract sculpture is easier to grasp than the 50 pages of Ogletree speculating on the nature and behavior of tachyons, hypothetical particles that travel faster than the speed of light. Much of the paper discusses the possible applications, including time travel. John references a concept, something he calls the Mobius worm. The math is too difficult for me to grasp. In light of recent events, this interests me. But then, what better way to plague a lab rat with a psychology degree? Can I seriously entertain the argument that I am traveling through time, seeing Francis Sheldon and his accomplices carry out their criminal enterprise on this island, and then being pulled back to the future? Hallucinations still seem more likely than that. Reading these entries, I had the sense that Dan was using them as a therapeutic coping mechanism. Yet the existence of these entries from the future? Past. But then, what if the entries were forged, if they were designed to trick us, much like the subjects in the Hebb experiment being led to believe in ghosts? Still, I read on. Winter. I have spent the last 3 days following the wreaths. They are always close to a wind chime. It took me a while to figure them out, but they appear to be markers. The breakthrough came to me when I canvassed the island. The control site is not on North Fox Island. There is a landing strip, but not one that bisects the island. When I follow the wind chimes and the markers, I can navigate my way through both islands. I am going to find Lucy. I did not have much more time to read all of the entries, and they were incomplete and erratic in any event. Dan was following a logic that I had not yet grown to appreciate. Did he believe that he was experiencing time travel? More importantly for my own sanity, did I believe that this was anything other than the planned design of the experiment? Could I let myself believe that we were beyond control? We left for the mainland. We took Lucy through the still abandoned control site, still no sign of any habitation, which seemed to convince her that leaving the island was our best chance of making it out of here alive. I did not tell her about what I had read in Dan's entries. Neither did Jake, and I assumed he had read most of them while I was consoling her. I was still suspicious of her motives. She had been so close to Dan and he was clearly involved in the design of the experiment. How could she claim this level of ignorance about his involvement and the project? Even now, after so much time has passed, I wonder if it would have made a difference. What if we had waited for a clear day? We might not have made it off the island, but I would not carry so much guilt today. But then I was worried about what had happened to Dan. I thought he had been murdered. I thought that there was something with us on that island, something that would hurt us all if we stayed. And that something was control. It was not the most rational explanation given Dan's apparent suicide, but this place had defied rationality at every turn. Dan had disappeared and died in the blink of an eye, only to become a ghost of winter's future, warning us about the dangers of time warps and a pedophile ring. I would not risk it. I wanted my parents, my brother, and sisters. I wanted to go home. So I tried. It was still snowing when we left. The daylight, obscured as it was by the blizzard that was laying siege to the island, still managed to drown out any light from the mainland that would guide us. But we knew the relative positions. We could not see any lights in the distance now, but it would take us most of the day to travel to the mainland. By the time night fell, flickering lights in the distance, what we assumed to be the mainland, would be our guide to safety. The shore closest to the beach was the most difficult terrain. There were mounds of ice that we had to carefully crawl over. It was not as bad when we further away, after about a mile of walking. But it was so slow. We had no idea if the ice would hold, so we had to walk with caution. The snowfall did not help matters, but on the frozen open water there was also no shield from the wind. It was roaring and whirling between us, so furiously working against us that at times it felt like moving through sand. We did not speak much. And time seemed to crawl just as slowly as we were walking. It was the worst hike I have ever taken. The snowfall was steadily increasing as we made our way to the mainland, and it started to obscure it. Jake walked a few feet in front of me, Lucy a few feet away by my side. I was struggling to keep pace with Jake, who was in better shape and was more determined than anyone else to make it to the light. As the hours passed, we were closer and closer, until eventually both dusk and the flickering light that had beckoned us the previous night came into view again. Just beyond the hills of ice that barricaded the mainland, separating us from safety. I felt the relief flow through me, even warming me. As cold and wet and miserable as I was, it was almost over. I could barely hear my own laughter over the whipping wind. It was the wind, I think, that got the best of Lucy. She could not hear the ice breaking beneath her feet. She screamed, but by the time I had turned around it was too late. She plummeted beneath the ice and into the water, and my flashlight caught only the briefest glimpse of her being pulled into the abyss of Lake Michigan, carried away by the turbulence of the currents rushing beneath the thin layer that separated us from a wet grave. I almost ran to her, but I couldn't. The ice was thin there, and I would be pulled into the water. We were helpless. I held Jake and we sobbed, and stared into the crevice that had swallowed Lucy. And I'm not proud of this, but I was also relieved. Relieved that it had not been me. Relieved that I was less than a mile away from seeing my family, from safety, and from warmth. So we marched on. The ice along the shoreline was difficult and we had arrived after dark, so there was almost no visibility. Once we were on the shoreline, we could make out the source of the light. A lighthouse. And near it, a pod. The same living pod that had been abandoned just days ago. when I walked with Jake to control. My heart sank. We were back. Lucy had died for nothing. At first, I thought that we had simply circled back, but there was something different this time. Something that had changed. The lighthouse was working, but that was not all. When we had arrived before, the lighthouse stood alone beside the pod, nothing but sand and dirt surrounding them. This was the same lighthouse and the same pod, but they were surrounded by trees and a few other structures. I wish control had been abandoned like it was before. I wish that there had been nothing at all. I clutched onto Jake's hand. I did not want to believe that we were still on the island. If there was a time for collective hallucinations, let this be it. But Jake stared at the lighthouse with the same sense of apprehension. We had crossed the frozen waters. Lucy and Dan were dead. We were chilled to the bone, hungry and thirsty and wet and terrified. We were too far away from the lighthouse to see anything with clarity, but we could hear faint voices in the distance. We consulted in whispers. Was it worth the risk? I still thought it was possible that control was behind Dan's death, and now they were just as culpable for Lucy as far as I was concerned. There was something terribly wrong with this place. We knew that much. Could we afford to trust control? Did we have a choice? I decided to risk it. If nothing else, we would have some answers to some questions. Maybe not the questions we had, and maybe not the answers that we were looking for. But it was worth a shot. Jake pulled at me when I started to walk to control, insisting that I wait. The voices in the distance started to rise. I still could not see anyone, but they were not rising solely as a result of our proximity. It was shouting, a confrontation of some kind. I noticed that there was smoke coming from the trees that surrounded the lighthouse. More shouting, it almost sounded like pleading. And then a gunshot. A few more seconds passed, and then the roar of an unseen siren cascaded across the landscape, drowning out any other sounds. We moved our hands to our ears, and Jake pointed to the other side of the island, stabbing his hand and fingers repeatedly. The smoke continued to rise, and now we could see the flicker of fire on the trees. We walked towards the other side of the island, circling around the tree line. I could see now that this patch of forest was burning at multiple points, casting a faint glow of orange light along the shoreline. There were several more gunshots, and we fled away, up along the coast to the larger forest, the actual forest, towards our base camp. It was still too dark to see much of anything, so we moved in darkness, and the siren slowly died, leaving us in relative silence, with a comfortable distance between our location and control. We walked much longer than I had expected. I stuttered out theories in low whispers, fearing control and the reach of whatever conflict had caused the forest fire. The optimist in the back of my mind experienced some glimmer of hope. The fire could attract attention from the mainland. It might just be what we needed for a rescue party. I shared this with Jake. Another mistake, made out of ignorance. I must have given him the idea. We walked for well over a mile before we decided that something was wrong. We should have come across the airstrip by that point, but we were still in the middle of a dense and seemingly endless forest. We decided to head for the coast and circle along the beach, trying to find strip that way. That was when we saw the wreath. The same wreath, the same wind chimes, that we had encountered days earlier, or weeks, or however long it had been before. Jake said it before I did. Made it real. They're markers, he said, echoing Dan's journal. We shouldn't be far now. Far from what? From the base camp? From Dan's lifeless corpse? From the charred ruins of the control site that seemed to phase in and out of existence? From barely more than a month's worth of food and shelter? From the erratic and increasingly incredulous ravings of one of the researchers who had led us to this icy grave? I was not far from any of these things, but I was far from home, and so far from caring about anything else. There were things that I had not shared with the others when we first arrived on the island. That my grandmother had died from lung cancer my freshman year. That my father had left my mother for 3 years when I was a child. That I had fallen in love and had my heart broken for the first time my freshman year of college. That I liked watching bad TLC reality television with my girlfriends. Now with Jake I shared all that and more. We had nothing but time, and no one but each other. When my grandmother received her diagnosis, there was a period of intimacy and connectedness with her that was more intense than anything else I had ever experienced. It was also a grueling and protracted encounter with human mortality. The past few days had also been grueling and grim. A shock to my senses were now scrambling to interpret the chaotic terrain of this place. Jake made it bearable. There was at least one morbid advantage to the lethality of this island prison: our food supply would last us for another 2.5 months at least. But this advantage seemed to dissipate in the face of other hard truths. The area surrounding the control site had burned, but there was no evidence of a rescue party or any interest from the mainland. No planes had circled the island. In fact, we had yet to see any evidence of airspace activity, with the exception of the strange light anomaly. We discussed our situation, of course. Dan's journal entries provided plenty of fodder for our increasingly complex conspiracy theories. My rationalist sensibilities had crumbled in the face of the walk across Lake Michigan, our inexplicable arrival on what we now assume to be South Fox after hours of traveling, and our encounter with the apparent arson and gun feud once we arrived. This was the time to suspend disbelief and follow the strange logic behind our experiences here. I was less inclined to accept the time travel thesis that had developed in Dan's journal entries. John Ogletree was a psychologist, not a rocket scientist. Hiring the professor to conduct a psychology experiment was a far cry from indulging his beliefs in pseudoscience. Jake was less skeptical on this point. He had drawn his own map of the islands. Not a map that was found in the travel guides, but one based on our experiences. A map that identified the relative locations of the markers that appeared to link North and South Fox, and showed our trajectory across the lake, looping back, inexplicably, to the control site on South Fox. Wormholes. Portals. Doors that cut across space-time, connecting two or more points that were separated by vast distances. If we think of space-time as a map, this makes sense, he explained, or as existing as a physical object, like one that can be traversed in another dimension. We walk through a portal, we come out in the same space, in a different time, or in the same time, in a different space, or in a different space and time. He looked intently at his drawing, frowning. The only problem is, it doesn't explain what we are experiencing. Dan disappeared, but he disappeared in one of the living pods. I thought back to his disappearance. It now seemed so long ago it was hard to remember the details. There were lights that night, and the power had gone off. We had seen lights that night and the engraving earlier. Something happened that night, with the lights. That's the first strange thing that I remember. I saw something, and the next night Dan and Lucy saw something. And a few nights later, we heard voices coming from across the shoreline. What if we heard our own voices? He drew a few more lines on the map, separating the shoreline from a mirror image of itself. One island, one group of people, two separate points in time. The lights on the flashlights flickered the night Dan disappeared, but we didn't have a power outage. There was an outage the night after they saw the lights. His voice trailed off. I still don't see a pattern. Nothing that can be mapped consistently. We were reaching the limits of our own knowledge. At the time, it seemed that there was something that fit together too well: the mystery itself, the strangeness of our situation, the inexplicability of it all. Jake seemed ready to embrace a fantastical explanation, but there were more mundane possibilities. What if our water supply was tainted with something designed to cause mild hallucinogens and we were being fed stimuli to create a collective delusion? What if we had been taken to a different set of islands altogether? What if we were not even on an island? We had not yet searched their living pods, and I made a point of avoiding Lucy's. Dan had disappeared there after all, and we had entered it shortly before our first visit to Control. If there were invisible wormholes, Lucy's living space was a prime candidate. It was Dan's quarters that held the most promise for something that approached a rational explanation. Jake and I traveled together, as we could not risk losing one another. It was difficult to maintain any physical distance in this place. A split second separated Lucy from Dan's death, and a few feet of distance swept her away from us and into the lethal waters below the ice. There was strength in numbers, but also strength in touch. By now it seemed more than psychological reassurance. His pod was bare, stripped to only essentials. I had decorated the interior of my room with gentle reminders of life beyond the island, but Dan had not treated the island like a winter retreat. It was a science project for him, and this was more akin to an office space than a living room. Jake found the photos. Of all of the possibilities contained in this place, this one seemed the most absurd. How can I even describe it clinically? Old negatives, depicting lewd and lascivious images of an adolescent male in various stages of undress, designed to appeal to prurient interests. Certainly nothing that I would have expected Dan to possess. Under normal circumstances I would simply have turned in this contraband to the police, but these were not normal circumstances. Jake studied the roll against the light. "It's just the one," he said. "No others." "The same kid." "Hard to tell where these were taken, but they're outside. Looks like sand dunes." I felt nauseous even discussing it, and searched for anything else. There was very little: psychology textbooks, cards, unused paper, clothing, nothing to point us in any sensible direction. Jake had a hypothesis, of course, Francis Sheldon. There was a certain seamlessness to that explanation, I admit. Whether or not you believed Dan's journal entries demonstrated that he was hallucinating under Control's influence or traveling through time, there was a book in the library that made mention of the incident. It included descriptions of child pornography, and the negatives in Dan's room seemed to align with Jake's proposed association. That night we drank. It was the last of Jake's alcohol and it was strong. We played cards and watched movies and tried to forget about the world. In my alcoholic fugue I imagined myself lost in the sets of Hollywood that paraded in front of my vision, away from this island and basking in the radiance of the Southern Californian sun. Jake had fallen asleep against me. I was nearly there myself when the power went off again. I woke him up and we dressed for the cold, to see if the lights had returned. At first there was nothing. The sky was clear, riddled with stars. My head was pounding, and I wondered if it was the onset of a migraine from the alcohol or from the stress. Then the hum started. I do not know how else to describe it. It was low at first, but became increasingly loud, a kind of static sound that almost sounded like radio. We headed towards the shore, in the direction where it seemed to be emanating from. As we crossed the treeline, the noise stopped and we saw it almost immediately. It was faint at first, growing steadily and seeping out across the sky in multiple directions, forming a tear in the sky. The green light seemed to pour out from a black sliver contained in the center, silently cascading across the sky until it engulfed the night sky as far as I could see. The elongated sliver that formed the center began to sway in the sky. It almost seemed to move like a planarian, worming its way slowly to different points against the green sky. I was reminded of my experimental design course with Ogletree the previous semester, studying the movement of flatworms through mazes. The resemblance was eerie, like the light was pouring out of a living organism that was tunneling across the night sky. It did not last for long. Without warning, the light imploded back to the sliver center, followed by an explosion of neon blue that quickly receded back until all that remained was a glowing blue filament, shaped like the black sliver that had just seconds ago swayed across the sky. So mesmerized and temporarily blinded by the blue light, I could now make out the siren echoing across the island. The same siren that we had heard on South Fox Island. It was Control. The blue filament was hanging in the sky as we made our way back to the base camp while the siren echoed in the distance. The power was still out, but I could make out a faint blue glow through the forest near the deer stand where we found Dan's body. The siren howled outside as we huddled together for warmth in the pod, discussing our options. Without power, we would not last. We had to make our way to South Fox. It was time to make contact with control. The blue, radiant filament hanging in the sky had dissipated by the time the sun rose and the sky was blue and clear after dawn. We had not slept well, but we had slept. The power was still off, and the winds were strong, scattering the fallen snow across the lake when we went outside and ventured to the shoreline facing South Fox. There was one known route to South Fox, and that would involve crossing the narrow channel that separated the neighboring islands. Crossing the water posed immense dangers, however, and we knew that there was a possibility, if Jake's theory was right, that we could make our way to the island through the marker system that Jake had mapped out. Abandoning my skepticism, I agreed that we should see if we could reach South Fox without crossing the frozen waters that had claimed Lucy's life during our failed escape to the mainland. I know how it sounds to you, whoever you are, reading this letter. And I was not sure that I even believed it was possible at the time. There was only one problem: the only time we had found control populated was the fourth, accidental visit. There were only 3 deliberate trips that we had made to control. The first 2 times, we had followed the coastline. The first visit we had encountered an abandoned site, the second visit we had encountered an empty site. Our third trip with Lucy went along the coastline, and we had discovered the same empty location. It was only when we had crossed the lake to try to reach the mainland that we had ended up, inexplicably, on South Fox. Jake suggested an alternative: if we believed Dan and Lucy, and Dan's journal entries, they had reached control sometime after we had left for our first trip. Their version did not have a lighthouse, and they claimed that they had spoken with the researchers and the power had been restored. On the way back, we went through the forest and had come across the Wreath and the Wind Chime. What if they had passed through the same area on their way to control, and returned along the coast? It would still not explain why we found the site empty on the second and third visit, or why they had not seen a lighthouse, but it might explain their ability to reach control. We walked through the woods, listening for wind chimes. At a few points we thought we came across areas that resembled the place we found the chimes and the wreath in the makeshift arch, but we could not be sure. We finally decided to continue towards the control site through the woods. When we came to an area near the shoreline, the area that had been empty during our second and third visits, we moved out of the woods and found, to our surprise, a living pod. It was accompanied by a small communications array, the only way I know how to describe it, and a generator. We knocked, but no one responded. The door was unlocked, and we walked into the first warmth we had experienced in hours. This pod was about the same size as the common area pod at the base camp, complete with 2 bunk beds and a computer with a monitor and printer. The power was still on, with a screen display. There was also a food storage unit and a refrigerator. With the possible exception of the communications array, this looked like what we had expected from control when we arrived on the island. We searched for clues. At this point, we knew that there had to be more to this experiment than what we were led to believe. We opened several files, but most of them appeared to be encrypted or password protected. Inside the desk, we discovered several items, however, including a calendar with several dates circled, including the date of our actual arrival and, inexplicably, December 20th, which had the word extraction handwritten on it, and December 21st, which had the words arrival handwritten on it. We knew that was wrong, though. We had arrived a week and a half before winter started, at Ogletree's insistence. That was why we had missed the holidays. And our departure date was in February, still a ways off. The dates did not correspond to anything that we knew about the experiment. I read through the remaining papers while Jake searched through the pod, making a mental list of the supplies so that we would have an inventory of what we could use. There was a 2-page memorandum on something called the Mobius worm. I remembered coming across the same when I read Dan's entries, that bizarre term. The first page offered an enigmatic description, replete with technobabble worthy of NASA, but also providing something that came close to a definition: an organism composed of exotic matter, possibly tachyons, detectable only by the presence of Cherenkov radiation. The second page contained no text, but was instead a color printout of an artist's rendition of the so-called worm, an image that bore an uncanny resemblance to the blue filament that had streaked across the night sky. There were more mysteries opened by this, if you will excuse my pun, can of worms than answers. I started talking while I read, a little excitedly and loudly. Jake came over and looked over the papers. A worm? He laughed slightly at the absurdity of it. A worm made of tachyons. I nodded. It was ridiculous. And still no sign of any research related to the actual purpose of the experiment, studying the effects of isolation for purposes of interplanetary expeditions. This seemed more along the lines of a decoy designed to instill false beliefs, much like the Heb experiment that Dan's journal entries referenced repeatedly. We decided to remain in the control facility. It still had running power and there were enough food supplies to last us for a while. The base camp was a death trap. For the first part of that night, we slept well. We woke late in the night as sounds erupted from the computer. A voice came through the monitor, male, professional, and the hint of ambient sounds in the background. I recognized it immediately: John Ogletree. Remote contact with North Fox Control 1 established. Initiating satellite telemetry feed. Estimated local time to contact from South Fox Control 2 is 5 minutes. Satellite telemetry feed is online. All systems go. Let's catch ourselves a worm. Jake and I stared at each other in disbelief and then began shouting at the monitor, but if they could hear us, there was no sign of it. After a minute or so we gave up, and waited to see if there was anything else. After a brief pause, the monitor switched to a live feed from what appeared to be satellite imagery of the islands. Ogletree's voice emerged again. Mission Control Alpha, this is South Fox Control 2. Rift is open, data transmitting to North Fox Control 1. The monitor switched, displaying a bewildering series of binary numbers. Estimated delivery time is 30 seconds. There was a long pause, and then Ogletree's voice returned. Initiating shutdown sequence in 10 seconds. Happy hunting, Joe Dot. His voice was cut off by the sudden wail of a siren, which itself was cut off when the monitor returned to the live feed of the satellite. Then Ogletree's voice returned almost as suddenly as it had disappeared, with cheering in the background. Mission Control Alpha. Data transmission successful. We did it. Subjects commenced expedition December 21, 2014 local time. We sat back bewildered as the cheering and applause continued, only drowned out by Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop. That continued for a while before another voice announced that the remote feed was being cut, and then there was silence. We stood in the pod, confused. We decided to go outside, to see if there was anything happening in the sky, again following whatever strange logic applied to life on this island. Had we heard transmissions from the past and the future? What was this worm Ogletree kept referring to? I felt, in that moment, that we were on the cusp. If we had just a little more time, I reasoned, we would have our answers. And now, with all the time in the world, I realize it would not make a difference at all. We stepped outside, and I looked to the sky. There were no stars, but there wasn't anything else either. No strange green lights, no blue filament, no strange hum. Just the stillness of that desolate place, and the harsh winds of winter. I walked to the shore while Jake explored the communications array. Was there a sign out there, across the water? Or were we stranded here forever? My eyes watered as I stared across the frozen terrain and into the wind. I thought about God for the first time since we arrived, my agnosticism shaken by the sense of doom and confusion this place had instilled in me. I heard a sound, a voice from the wilderness. Jocelyn. And now I have to laugh, because in those brief moments, seconds really, between the time I heard something and the time I turned around, taking a moment to clear the water from my eyes, I thought just maybe it was a sign of God answering my unspoken prayers. And now, looking back, I realize it was a sign. Just not a sign from God. It was Dan. Back from the dead. I was staring at a ghost. Those were my first thoughts. It was not that Dan was an incorporeal specter or that I believed in ghosts, but in those first few seconds my mind could not imagine another possibility. I had seen his body hanging, twisting in the winter winds. He ran up to me, hugged me, clutched me. I took a moment before embracing him back. I had not known Dan for long, but in this place, and under these bizarre circumstances, it very much felt like seeing an old friend for the first time in years. At this moment his face was still concealed in darkness, I could only make out the dim outlines. It was so dark here, without any light from civilization. What happened? He asked me. Where are the others? Where's Lucy? His voice shook when he asked, and I could not bring myself to tell him. I would let Jake do that. Jake's at control, I said. Just up the shore. He stared at me, not responding, still holding my shoulders. Control? Jocelyn, I was just on my way back to control. He pointed further down the shore. It is southeast of here, on the tip of the island. Do you know where you are? This was ridiculous. We were so close to it, surely he had seen it on the way in? I shook my head. We're on South Fox. No, I don't think so. We saw the site on South Fox, but there's another one. Just look over dash dot. I started to point it out to him. Even in the blackness, there was the dim lights of the communications array. But when I looked, there was nothing. My stomach dropped. No control. No communications array. And no Jake. I screamed for him then. There was nothing else that mattered in that moment. I had been so stupid, so foolish to leave him alone, to walk down to the shore. Dan tried to calm me down, holding me, telling me it was all right. But it was not all right. Jocelyn, I cannot explain it all, but I have some answers. If you will just listen, but we need to get out of the cold. He brushed my hair back, trying to soothe me. It is too cold here. I've been wandering all day, we need to get back to control. I protested. We needed to find Jake. We will, Dan promised. But I can only do that from control. I'll explain it all there. More walking in the dark. How I had grown to hate this. An endless series of futile ventures through frozen, barren woods. We cut across through the woods, heading southeast. He kept asking about Lucy, and I skillfully evaded answering directly until he stopped the questioning. We came to control after maybe a half hour of walking. It was not what I remembered. The patch of trees on the tip of the island that surrounded the site was gone. The facility the research team had named Control, or maybe South Fox Control 2, was an old lighthouse and one large pod. It was seemingly identical to the site I had discovered with Jake, the night Dan and Lucy had found the North Fox Control site. The door to the lighthouse was still chained and it was clear no one had been in there for a while, but the living pod was warm when we entered. Lived in. There were sheets, blankets, and pillows on twin double-stacked beds in the corner. I found this place empty, Dan explained. There were people here at one point, but by the time I reached it, nothing. He opened one of the food storage containers, and removed packets for instant coffee. He turned on the water boiler, waiting and looking at me. You like hazelnut, right? I smiled and nodded. He grinned. Thought so. So look, I owe you an explanation, he continued, getting 2 cups out. But I need you to tell me what happened after I left. I explained that he had disappeared, that we had gone searching for him, and found the control site on North Fox empty. I told him that we had left the island, that Lucy was upset by his absence, that we made it to South Fox instead of the mainland. That we had seen the site, that we had heard some kind of confrontation and gunshots, and that we had fled when the fire started. I told him about the marker system, the strange light show back at base camp and the transmissions at the North Fox control site. I left out the parts about death. And I left out the parts about his journal entries, saving it for last. It's your turn, I said when he handed me my cup of coffee. And I should warn you, I've read your journal. So let's be honest about what's going on here. He looked surprised. You found my journal? Where? It was in the treehouse or deer stand or whatever that thing is, on North Fox. I sipped my coffee, relishing the hint of hazelnut. I couldn't remember having flavors back at base camp. It reminded me so much of home. There were entries dated after you left. He laughed. That little bastard. He must have taken it, his voice trailed off. So you know, then. About the experiment. I'm not firm on details, Dan. I just know that you knew much more than you were letting on. I thought I knew, he corrected me. I thought I knew what this was about. But Jocelyn, I was so wrong. You probably know as much as I do about why we are here. Why we're really here. Tell me, Jocelyn, how much time has passed for you since I disappeared? I thought back. It had only been a few days, maybe a week. I said as much. What if I told you that over 4 months had passed for me? I've been here for months, Jocelyn. I would have died in a few days if I hadn't stumbled on this site. I was not as surprised as I would have been under ordinary circumstances. He sat beside me, cup in hand, and started to recount his story. Professor Ogletree approached me in the spring semester before we left. He wanted me to participate in an experiment. He told me he had received funding from NASA, which as far as I know is true. They wanted to replicate some isolation studies under controlled conditions, in a communal setting. The HEB experiment, I think you know it? The purpose was the same purpose that was explained to you, operating together as a group, mimicking the conditions that would confront astronauts on an interplanetary expedition. I did have some advantages. Or at least, I thought I did. I was a Boy Scout growing up, and had some training for dealing with the wilderness, that was one. But more importantly, I knew that there was going to be external stimuli, and I was told what it would be. Strange lights at night, confusing movements of the control facility. I was also told that there would be an extraction site if something happened to control. I never had much reason to second guess this. Even when you mentioned the engraving after Jake read that book, I thought, this is all part of it? I'm pretty sure Lucy didn't question it either. I kept her in the dark for the most part. I had to, we were being recorded. Or so they told us. But I did let her know about the extraction site, after we went looking for you, and for Jake. She wanted to know why you weren't able to find control, and I told her that Ogletree had given me some inside knowledge. That control would occasionally move to throw us off, but that it was all part of the experiment, and if there was an actual emergency we would never be far from the extraction site. One day I was talking to Lucy, heading towards her pod. We were going to make journal entries together. That was pure luck. I would have been lost without it. She opened the door, I followed her in, and I found myself outside again, in the woods. I walked and walked and walked through the woods, looking for the base camp. I found it, but it was empty. There were structures, but they were empty. And cold. The deer stand behind the trees was there as well. Except it wasn't the same, it was, I don't know. More juvenile, like a treehouse. Or a fort, I guess. I camped out there, took some supplies from the base camp to make fires. Sometimes it worked, but not when the lights came. The fire would go out, and I would just stare up at the green waves rippling out. I was losing track of time. I made a makeshift sundial for when there was enough light to read it, but it never seemed to change. And so much time was passing, or has passed. But it was always the same. Even after months had passed, I started estimating time. I'm getting ahead of myself. I started to hallucinate. Or at least, I thought I was hallucinating. I'm not sure how you made sense of the journal entries. At some point, months ago, I saw the boys. And then I could feel warm, like it was summer. I became convinced I was hallucinating because of that damn book Jake had read. These boys, they weren't alone. I could hear them with men, and the sounds. Dan stopped, finished his coffee. They were being raped. I knew that much. And one of them could see me. He kept looking at me. The one with the red shirt. I saw them a few times, at the deer stand or whatever you want to call it. And I don't know how to describe this, but it was like there was two of everything in the natural environment. It was all blurred, kept shifting, but I could see the boys climbing into the treehouse with me, and they got in, and the one with the red shirt looked right at me, startled. And then I could hear adults in the distance, and they ran away. I could also feel warmth when I saw them. Like warm wind cutting through the cold winter air. But I was also getting desperate around this point. The base camp disappeared entirely. I would wander the woods through the day until one day I stumbled onto the site. He gestured around us, referencing South Fox Control. It was abandoned, pretty much like you see it now. But it had food, shelter, warmth, and information. He grabbed a pile of papers and handed it to me. Like this. It was a curriculum vitae for John Ogletree. Now tell me, how many people do you know with doctorates in psychology, and a master's degree in physics? I didn't know that about him, I admitted. So he wasn't a complete quack. I wouldn't go that far. Dan took the papers back. I lost it when I went to base camp, but he also wrote a paper that sounds like something from a Star Trek episode. Stuff about tachyons and wormholes and time travel. Nothing that I would expect NASA to take seriously. But clearly, they are. And as you probably guessed, for good reason. You mentioned that paper in your journal entries. When did you lose it? I was comfortable here but restless, and I knew that I had to find you guys, so I would venture out, try to make my way to the base camp. Once I figured that I could get there from here. At one point I found it, but it was empty. I checked out the treehouse again, and that's when I heard it. And I knew. I saw the boy with the red shirt. He was there, naked, being photographed by an adult. Dan picked up a pad of paper. Do you remember this? It was the log I had discovered from the hunting party, the first time I came across the deer stand. Check the dates. When I had first examined the log, there was no reason to believe that anything strange was happening with time. I was so focused on the unusual find that I had not noticed the year of the entries, from June. June of 1975. It's not a hunting log, Dan explained. It's for nature observing. The pretext for Sheldon's camp. And look at the date on the last page. June 22nd, 1975. The summer solstice. What are you trying to say? I think you know, Jocelyn. But when I was there, when I was listening to those men talk to that boy, when I heard them whisper cruel jokes to themselves about ogling Ogletree, I used one of the keys I found in this place, to etch it into the wood on the deer stand. F. Sheldon plus J. Ogletree were here. He was one of the boys. Bingo, Agatha Christie. And imagine my surprise when one of their many negatives depicting him ended up there, crossing the threshold between 1975 and 2015. I grabbed it for proof, along with the entries. Took it back to base camp. He shook his head. Unfortunately, I got ahead of myself, and forgot what I had left behind. My mind was still reeling from this revelation, which had turned the entire experiment upside down. I could see it now. Professor Ogletree knew about this island, he knew about Dan, he knew about so much. What did you leave behind? Well, I think you found one of the items, he said. Just not the most important one. I left behind my journal. I'm sure the little polymath punk managed to read it before you recovered it. But more importantly, I left behind Ogletree's paper. The one dated 2017. He paused, waiting for me to respond. Don't you see, Jocelyn? He already knew what would happen. He knew our names before we were even born. He has had 40 years to prepare for this. I am no longer religious, but my mother was. She would take me to church, and I would go to Sunday school. I do not remember much of the Bible, but I remember some parts. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, from Ecclesiastes. I returned, and saw under the sun, that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Of all the poetry contained in those fables, I thought those were among the best. I remember our pastor explaining them, that the word for chance in ancient Hebrew did not mean randomness or happenstance, but occurrences, or events. God charting the course of human destiny, the rise and fall of nations and the triumphs and tragedies of the prophets and their kin. When I was a child I believed this. There was an appointed time to everything that happened in your life, a loving God who intervened in everyday affairs. It was a simple if at times contradictory belief. When my grandmother died, I wished that I could return to it, wished that I could share in the hope of life after death, a faith my grandmother and mother had both shared. The belief that God was loving and just and merciful and kind and compassionate, however, ran up against his decision to send my grandmother to an early grave. When I listened to the words roll off of Dan's tongue, I thought that I did have gods watching over me. Gods with powerful abilities and mastery over time, led by someone who had been tortured as a child, subjected to horrific sexual abuse and, in that moment, had discovered a key to unlocking mysteries that humanity had never dreamed of. How long did it take John Ogletree to realize he was seeing someone from the future? How was that even possible? How was any of it possible? I stared at Dan in silence and horror as he smiled, finishing his story. He was proud of himself for unlocking the mystery. He had connected many of the dots in this barren landscape. Except the part that now mattered most, the mechanics. It was one thing to discover the strange properties of this island, and another thing to explain it, and still another to escape it. We discussed our options, which were limited. My first priority was to find Jake. I told him that we needed to return to the base camp on North Fox Island to find him. And what about Lucy? He asked. Is she with him? I am not proud to admit that I lied. I am not sure that I was convincing, but I did not want to crush whatever remained of Dan's spirit. I could sense that he had held on to her, that their connection and his knowledge that she was somewhere on this island probably explained why he had not succumbed to despair and suicide. And before you judge me too harshly, remember that I had seen him hanging from a tree. At some point in time, he could very well become a suicide risk. I did not want to be responsible for pushing him over the edge. As we sorted through possible plans, I began to mentally review my brief professional relationship with Professor Ogletree. I had taken a few classes with him, the most memorable being the experimental design course. The reason that I assumed I had been selected for this experiment. I had no reason to believe Dan was aware of our interaction in that course, or the assignment we had received on flatworms. Still, nothing about that assignment seemed applicable at first, did it? We were trying to test an experiment from the 1960s that suggested flatworms inherit the memories of other flatworms by consuming them, allowing them to successfully navigate through a maze without prior experience. And the alternative hypothesis, the one that Ogletree had pushed me to consider, the worms were not able to circumvent the maze by memory, but because they followed along the remains of a viscous mucus deposited by the very planarian worms that they would later consume, the so-called slime trail hypothesis. Of course. The Mobius worm, his description of the blue filament in the sky. An organism made of exotic matter, tunneling through space-time the way that a planarian worm would navigate a maze, leaving the equivalent of a trail that someone could follow in its wake. And we had heard him over the transmission. Let's catch ourselves a worm. John Ogletree, circa December 21, 2014. The winter solstice, and the day his subjects began their real experiment, the first expedition. I shared this theory with Dan, and was somewhat surprised that he didn't resist. It certainly fits the data, as crazy as it sounds. But let's assume you are right. How do we get out of here? That's what we need to focus on. The mechanics. I couldn't disagree with that. But then, there was the calendar from the North Fox control site. What if the extraction isn't a place, but a time? I offered. The map that Jake had developed was spatial, but the markers seemed to delineate points in both time and space. What if it is the day before the solstice? We had read that on the calendar we found at the site on North Fox. That word, extraction, placed on that date. Dan wanted to believe, but he had followed the markers for even longer than we had. The markers were inconstant, fluctuating. We might be able to make it to the base camp area, but who knows when we will arrive, or how long we will be able to stay there, he asked. At South Fox, there was power and food, warmth, and sustenance. Are you willing to risk it? I was willing to risk it to find Jake. I knew that much. Dan flinched when I mentioned them. God, if only he had told me. If only I had told him. Did we both know? Or is that my memory finally playing tricks on me again? I wish I could say for certain. All I know is that the road to hell was paved with the best of intentions. Dan finally agreed, willing to risk it for Lucy, if not Jake. And the possibility of escape. We packed food, water, and what remaining items of evidence we had, some flashlights, and made our way through the woods. Dan had found one of the markers out there, and it sometimes led back to the base camp on North Fox. Naturally, we were lost in the woods, in the dark, for some time. But as cold and miserable as it was out there, my will was stronger than it had been since we made our way to the mainland. There was a chance we could make it out of here alive. We could tell our story to the world. We did make it to the base camp. It was empty, just as Jake and I had left it earlier. There was still no power, but huddled inside the living pod, under layers and layers of blankets to keep ourselves warm. I fell asleep, snuggled up against Dan. He was warm for a walking corpse. And I dreamed that I was back home, with my family, and the others were visiting. Even Lucy. We woke late the next day and I went to Jake's pod, to see if he was there. No luck, of course. Dan told me he was going to collect some materials for a fire. I decided to wait in the common pod. I should have followed him. He was gone for several uneventful hours, while I waited and hoped for Jake to return. Eventually I went to look for him. He was in my living pod. I froze when I saw him sitting on my bed, staring at the pages of my journal. The iciness of the island returned. How could I have been so stupid? This is an interesting story, he said, turning over the pages, his eyes fixated. Were you going to share any of it with me? I did not know what to say. He must have read it all. I had not written much after Dan disappeared, but I had written enough. Short entries from the date of his death. Our discovery of the body. And of course Lucy. He wiped tears from his eyes. I already knew about Lucy, he said. He lifted his head up and closed his eyes, appearing to search his memory. I started to apologize, but he shook his head. I know why you did it. I had hoped there was a chance he was wrong. He reached into his pocket and took out some papers, unfolding them. I found this on him. It was for you. He handed the papers to me and I read. Jocelyn. I do not know how long it has been since you disappeared. I have lost track of time. I could not risk leaving the control site if there was any chance of a rescue. I don't think it is possible though. I searched through more of the files on the computer. It is hard to tell for sure, but I don't think this was ever about time travel. I think it was about traveling to other worlds. I think that they are looking for a shortcut, a wormhole. They think that they've found it here. I've had time to think about it, Jocelyn. Too much time. Ogletree said that his subjects were going on an expedition. That's us. But I don't think he knows how it works. He knew a lot, but how much could he know about what it is like on this place? People visit at different times of the year, but he chose the solstice. It was important, maybe the only time of the year that you can come here and find these things, whatever they are. But can you leave? The day after you disappeared, I found Lucy on the shore. She was so cold. She had been in the water for a while. The Ottawa and Chippewa have legends about this place, and they once buried their dead on South Fox. Is that a coincidence? Maybe only the dead are alive here. Maybe we are already dead. I don't know. I only know that I cannot stay here alone anymore. I am going to look for South Fox Control too. Whatever we heard on the computer, that's when it actually starts. That's when they know how to open the wormhole, how to send us here. Time is a circle here, and Ogletree knew enough to send the information back to NASA, to send us out here. But Dan and Lucy visited the North Fox site, made it here before it was evacuated. If I can reach South Fox Control, I may be able to leave. If I can stop them from contacting North Fox, I can prevent them from opening the anomaly and undo the damage that they caused. I am hoping that you do not find this letter. If you do, that means that you have not made it out of here or that I have joined Lucy and Dan, wherever they are. If you do find this and you do make it out, please tell my family that I love them, all of them. I hope that I will see you soon. J. Dan found his body on South Fox, next to the control site after it had been abandoned. He was shot to death. I think he tried to burn them out, Dan said, hugging me gently. Of course he had. I had seen the fires. I've been thinking about this, Dan told me. Ogletree could see me. He saw me on the summer solstice. But the other boys didn't, and the men didn't. I think your theory is half right. I think that we are on a path, following whatever anomaly or Mobius worm Ogletree talks about. But I don't think we are all on the same trail all the time, and I don't think that the markers work for everyone, or all the time. I don't think that they can be mapped. And I don't think that we are the only ones touched by this thing. So what do you think it is? He paused. I think that Ogletree is the crux, the nexus point for all of us. He crossed over first, in 1975. And I think he thought it worked with markers, because that's what everything he saw led him to believe. But tachyons, if they exist, can travel backwards and forwards in time, right? At least from what I gathered from that paper. So maybe this Mobius worm can do the same. Which explains us, but it doesn't explain him. As far as we know, Ogletree only moves forward in time. We had each visited and viewed points in the past and the future. It started with the lights, but that wasn't our own movement through time. It was like two parallel views of the island, close in space and distant in time. But we started to move in different directions only after the power went out and the rippling lights appeared in the sky. Jake and I had searched for Dan and Lucy, but they were gone. We went to look for them and came across the site on South Fox, in the future, and they crossed the island to find researchers at the North Fox site, before the solstice. Dan had simply disappeared, but we knew he had made it very far back, all the way to 1975. And Lucy's body had reappeared on the shore, the day after the solstice. What are you suggesting? Someone placed the markers here, Dan said. Someone designed them. I assume he saw them in the woods. He was a smart kid, he figured it out. He had years to study this place, learn its contours, remember my journal. Dan held his own journal in his right hand when he said this, Sheldon's logbook still in his pocket. He gave us a navigation system. I don't think he wants us to fail, I think NASA believes we'll make it out of there. I think he believes the extraction site will work. But he doesn't have all of the information. Maybe he finds out later, when whoever is protecting the South Fox site shoots Jake. Or maybe he found out after that. But that doesn't help us. In December of 2014, he is convinced that he can send us through time and space, and that it isn't a one-way ticket. I know this man, Jocelyn, he is not a monster. I chewed on this. So what should we do? I think that there is only one thing to do. Dan opened the door, looking outside across the airstrip towards the tree line. We can move back and forth through time, and he can only move forward through time. If I can warn him, convince him in 1975, gain his trust, save him from those monsters, then I can undo ... I was staring right at him when it happened. It was the most unsettling thing that I had seen since our arrival. He disappeared before the sound of his last words even had time to reach my ears. There was no time for me to blink before he was gone. That was months ago. Winter never left. Or more likely, I never left winter. I am still here, wandering the island. Waiting for them. Not for the others. I know that they are not coming back. I'm waiting for the things that Ogletree was studying. The so-called Mobius worms. I know what happened. I know that Dan made it to 1975. I know that he tried to save Ogletree. I know that he failed, and that he also risked exposing Sheldon's pedophile ring. I know that they hanged him, trying to make it look like a suicide. And I know that no one could find his body, because it never stopped moving through time. Just like Lucy. Just like Jake. And soon, just like me. I know these things because Professor Ogletree knew these things. A few weeks ago I was traveling, trying to find a power source. It has been so cold for so long. I could not reach the North Fox control site, or South Fox control. Sometimes when I walked through the woods, I would hear things. Voices whispering in the dark, conversations drifting on the river of time. I heard my grandmother, and other voices of the dead, and the voices of the ones who have not yet died. Sometimes I hear my own voice, and I think it is only in my head. But I know better now. That day a blizzard came in, and I was lost. Eventually I found myself on the edge of the wood, near the airstrip and the base camp. The snow was blowing so hard I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I heard the wind chimes. It was followed by a gust of warm wind, and the voice of what sounded like a teenage boy screaming. I clutched my coat against my chest, and when I looked up I saw his body flailing in the wind, hanging from the tree that housed the deer stand. He had a note in his pocket. The first suicide, as far as I know, and a grim tribute to the man who tried to save him. His note filled in some of the gaps. I don't know if I should trust it or anything else in this place. But I won't keep you waiting much longer. They want you to know about this. That's the only reason I am still alive. I am their prophet, the messenger. John's final words confirmed much of what I learned in those last few days. The South Fox Control 2 site was a second expedition, sent 3 years after we disappeared. That was when he expected to find us. Safe and in our futuristic cabins, waiting for revelation that we had traveled through time, into the future. He excused his manipulations. We were going to be rewarded after all, celebrated as humanity's saviors. He knew about Dan, of course, from the Sheldon days, but he did not realize that Dan could see him. He had spent years modeling the equations, figuring out the mysteries of the islands. He thought Dan was safe, like the rest of us. They never saw Jake at South Fox. Just a shadowy figure moving through the edge of the burning woods, trying to destroy the facility and their array and undermine the experiment. I believed the professor when he wrote this. I think that those things took his body before the NASA team had a good look at it, moved it right where Dan could see it, months or years later for Dan. I don't think that they even knew that they had shot someone. They probably moved it, us, around until we disintegrate, if they wanted to. I'm not up on those details. Not yet. It took NASA over 2 years to develop the technology from the plans that were sent to them the night our expedition began. 2 years to figure out how to catch these things, the Mobius worms. They are named after both a mathematician and the blue filaments, a wake of Cherenkov radiation left over after they are doused with whatever particles the NASA satellite used to try and slow them down. Imagine an organism, if that is even the right word, that is made of exotic matter. Matter with a negative mass, or even matter that travels faster than the speed of light, like tachyons. Such a being would be totally alien, its movements and patterns and thoughts incomprehensible. But what if it left a trail in its wake? What if operated like a flatworm, and followed a series of trails created by manipulating exotic matter, trails made by similar beings? An entire ecosystem that we would have little to no capacity to detect. Unless, somehow, you were caught in the wake. Unless you were trapped in the exotic matter equivalent of a slime trail. If you could learn how to navigate it, you could reach the stars. Still, what good would it be to blindly follow the trail of something that freely moved through black holes and stars? The Mobius worms were useless and incomprehensible unless they were captured and controlled. There's another way to interpret the data supporting Ogletree's tachyon slime trail theory. Some flatworms use the viscous mucus they travel on to trap their prey. I think that the Mobius worm trails can also function in much the same way. Ogletree realized that in the end, right after they sent the signal to North Fox Control, their communications array and the rest of his team disappeared instantly, scattered over space and time. They left John on North Fox. He says he made it 2 weeks. They sent him back to 1975, to watch the men hang Dan in secret, away from the boys. Until then, he only remembered Dan as a ghost that haunted him and watched older men brutalize him. John never attributed intelligence to them. He thought that they were advanced beasts of burden, potential tools for humanity's future expansion across the stars. He knew better at the end. So do I. They understand us better than we understand ourselves. Dan thought that the wreaths and the wind chimes were a relic of Ogletree's visits to the island. I don't think so. I think that they put them there. I think that they put that book in the common library. I think that they removed Dan's engraving left for me, as a clue, and then put it back for Jake. I think that they made sure my last cup of coffee that I will ever drink was laced with hazelnut. I think that they toy with us the same way that they toy with time. What is time anyway? Just objects in motion. How could they have been so arrogant? To think that they could manipulate beings who can send signals to themselves back in time. Beings that can prevent an attack before it even occurs. Beings that can weave time the way a spider weaves a web. I know better. I think that I am alive because I have one last task for them. My name is not really Jocelyn. I love my family, and I hope they never find out what happened here. I came here with some strangers. Their names were not really Dan, Jake, and Lucy, but they are gone, and I do not think I will ever see them again. We were stranded on Lake Michigan last winter, but we were not alone. Do not look for us. Do not come to this place. Just make sure that there is no third expedition. This was only their warning shot. I have spent 3 weeks writing this, and I am done now. You'll find it somewhere, sometime. I am going to seal it in one of Jake's bottles, and then I am going for a swim.